Good morning, everyone. My name's Annie Clarke. I'm a Professor of Archaeology here at the University of Sydney. And today I'm going to talk to you about research that we did a few years ago now at the quarantine station in Manly. It's quite relevant in many ways in terms of what's going on at the moment with the COVID-19 pandemic. But what I want to explain today is kind of how archaeology and history work together to produce what we called stories from the Sandstone. So understanding some of the history and archaeology at the quarantine station and something about the lives of the people who were quarantined there over 150 years ago. So in this slide, this is our research team. So Peter Hobbins and Alison Bashford are two historians and medical historians. So they have a great understanding of medical history. And looking at particular outbreaks like typhoid, cholera, smallpox, the plague outbreaks. So they were able to provide us with the historical background to the archaeological material that then we were investigating at the quarantine station. So in the forefront of that picture are Ursula Frederick and myself. We're two archaeologists. And we undertook a study of all of the archaeological material at the quarantine station, but in particular we were looking at the inscriptions that people in quarantine made when they were held at the quarantine station when they were disembarked from their ships. And so archaeology, which is what my speciality is people tend to equate that with excavation, in foreign countries, the deep past perhaps, thousands of years ago. But we also do archaeology of the very recent past, of the last 50 years or 150 years. And so that, in a sense, is what we've been looking at the quarantine station. So rather than excavating physically in the dirt, we have been doing survey work, looking at the kinds of marks that people left, the way they represented in the rocks around the quarantine station, their experiences of travelling to Australia by ship, and also the way that they experienced quarantine whilst they were held at the quarantine station for anything up to 40 days. And so this kind of way of looking at mark-making practices is another thing that archaeologists do. We understand it, we do it through rock art that Indigenous people in Australia made in the past. We can do it through the kinds of mark-making and representations that people made in the more recent past, in sort of the last 150 years. And so that's what we did at the quarantine station. Okay, in this slide, what we can see here is a Navy vessel coming in through the heads of Sydney, heading in towards the naval base. But in many ways, being here at the quarantine station, one of the things that being in the landscape and working in the landscape does, it helps us as archaeologists sort of have some connection with people in the past, the way in which they might have seen and visualised and experienced being in place. So at the quarantine station, which when it was first set up in the 1830s was a very isolated part of the New South Wales colony and a part of the sort of Sydney area, Greater Sydney area. And it was chosen because it's on a headland, it's easy to keep people inside the quarantine station, and it's a very and still is to a certain degree, quite isolated. It's now a very beautiful part of Sydney Harbour National Park, and a place that people go and visit, and walk around during the day. But 150 years ago, it would have been quite isolated, very bushy, and there's a view that you can see in this slide across to Sydney town would not have existed. There would have been maybe some small houses and huts on the foreshore. There would have been a few buildings around. You'd have seen smoke from fires. But even so, even though that vista is different today, being in place in the same landscape that people were held in quarantine does allow us to get a sense, in a way, of the kind of experiences that they would have had being held there 150 years ago. And this photograph kind of, whilst it's a modern ship, it does show, the kind of vista that people would have seen from the quarantine station, looking out from where they were held in quarantine, confined in quarantine, out to the city of Sydney where they was going to go for their new life if they were migrants that had come from England or from other parts of Europe. So in a funny way, you know, that just sitting there and being in place allows us to imagine and reimagine parts of that past. This next slide is a very early photograph of the quarantine station from the late 1870s, early 1880s. We're not sure who took it. But one of the things it does show, I think, and again, it's part of that imaginary, okay, where you can see a past landscape, and it helps you to think about questions, of the sorts of questions that you might think about asking about a historical photograph. What does it tell us? What doesn't it tell us? What doesn't it show us? And whilst there are very few notes with this photograph album that it comes from in the State Library, one of the things that we can see is there are some new buildings going up in the background. There's a ladder on one of the buildings, suggesting that it's in the perhaps final stages of being put together and built. And we know again from historical records the sort of period of time that those buildings were being constructed. But perhaps of more interest is the kind of landscape that the buildings are sitting in. It's still quite bushy, so it's just the sort of sandstone scrub and heath. It isn't the manicured lawns. If you go to the quarantine station for a visit, you know, it's all surrounded by lawns and manicured gardens. They hadn't been created yet, so the buildings are still sitting in the bush landscape. And then on the rock in the foreground is a man, and he's got a young child in his arms, and then there's a child standing next to him. Now, one of the things that's not clear from the photograph, but again, it prompts us, it acts as a prompt to ask questions, is, you know, who is that person? What are they people? Is it somebody who's in quarantine? If it is somebody in quarantine, what were the circumstances that brought them there? Where's the mother? Okay, so, you know, unusually perhaps for that time, we've got dad with the two kids. So does this mean that mother was held in one of the hospital areas or in isolation, that she'd been sick? Had she passed away on the voyage? You know, who is the photographer? You know, who's actually taking that photograph and structuring that image? And so, you know, what was their relationship to the people that are being photographed there? Are they staff members, perhaps, from the quarantine station? And so, just again, using documents and archives and things like historical photographs, we can start to sort of think about the experience, the place, push ourselves back into that time period, partly through a process of imagination, but also through a process of observation. And that's one of the things, you know, that we do in archaeology, is both use inference and imagination, as well as observation, to kind of construct kind of ideas about how people used to live in the past, and what the kind of historical evidence that we see, and the material evidence, which is what predominantly archaeology deals with, how we might interpret that. In the next slide, this is a historic slide again. It's a photograph that's held here at the university in the Macleay Museum collection, and it was taken by an amateur photographer, and it shows scenes from the quarantine station, again early scenes, and it's an early photograph. And what we can see, and what's interesting about this photograph, we can actually still go to the same set of rocks at the quarantine station today. And if you'll notice in the background, there are some paintings, okay, so there's some painted names on those rocks. And it does seem, and those images are not there, those representations are not there today, so they have been either removed or painted over, or even inscribed over in the more recent past by other people coming into quarantine. But it does show us that you know, there's been a sort of process of people writing their names or writing the names of ships that they came to Australia on, as long as the quarantine station has had a presence in that landscape. And so it's little glimpses like that from historical photographs. There are very few of these photographs that show the inscriptions from the time that they were, probably around the time that they were made. You just see some examples of the kinds of things that we were studying, these inscriptions. And so what happened when ships were quarantined and passengers were disembarked and held in various buildings or in tents originally around the quarantine station, we find on the rock surfaces, on boulders, on cliff faces, on rock platforms, people, like people do today with graffiti, people wrote their names, sometimes with a date. And then at other times, people, as you can see in some of these slides, images, some of the inscriptions are quite formal. So they look more like the kinds of things that you see in churches or on tombstones. They're a name of the ship and a list of some of the more senior staff on the ship, the commander, the engineer, sometimes the doctor, and sometimes the mason would put their name in the inscription as well. And so across the quarantine station, there's something like 1,600 or more of these inscriptions located in different parts of the landscape. And some of them most of them are in English, but we have ones in Chinese, we have ones in Russian, Greek, Italian, and there are some Arabic inscriptions as well. So one of the interesting things about the quarantine station and about the assemblage of inscriptions there is that people would carve on anything that was stood still long enough, essentially. And so this is a flagpole up on Canai Point, and it's the flagpole just outside the main buildings of the quarantine station. And the flagpole is the flagpole that the health authorities would raise the yellow flag of quarantine upon, to note that there was a quarantine episode and there was ships in quarantine. The flagpole itself is historically significant because it's quite old, so it dates again to the 19th century. And there are inscriptions all over it, so people have gone up there over the years, I mean, both in the past and more recently, and inscribed their names, as you can see from this photograph. The quarantine station also had another role. So from the late 1950s through to the 1970s, it was it was the first official immigration detention centre. So we know now how people who've come into Australia or try to get into Australia, get incarcerated on Christmas Island and other offshore islands. In the 1950s, 60s, and early 70s. People who had either overstayed their visa, stowed away on ships, come into the country via unofficial means, shall we say, and if they were caught, they were returned to this immigration detention centre on the quarantine station before being sent back to their country of origin. So a building at the quarantine station, today it's labelled A20, and originally it was built as a staff quarters in the 1920s. So it was like a staff mess with some rooms for eating, for sleeping, and there are bathrooms there. Today it's a wedding reception centre, which is kind of an interesting repurposing of the building, but it's perfect because that has a very large kitchen, bathrooms, and large spaces. But from the late 1950s through, as I said, to the early 1970s, it became an immigration detention centre. And so because it was, there were lots of it was for men, so young men and older men who were kept there and held there for, up to 2-3 weeks, sometimes a bit longer while their cases were heard. So there we find not so much inscriptions, but what we would kind of, I guess, call graffiti. So people have used pencils, biros, texters, they've used sharp pointy things, probably a nail or the end of a pen or the lid of a biro to scratch into the wall. And so we get a whole series of other kind of mark making processes which are both different from but also sometimes mirror the inscriptions from quarantine. So we get names, we get dates, and we get sometimes the place where people have come from. So in the inscriptions or the graffiti that we were able to record are a lot of people from Fiji, from Tonga, so Polynesians who'd overstayed visas, some Chinese people, Yugoslavians, Filipinos, some Europeans, so people from across the world who came to Australia for whatever, often as for economic reasons. And interestingly, the main difference between the inscription assemblage and the graffiti assemblage is in the graffiti you get much more commentary about being held in Australia, what they wanted to do in Australia, how they found Australia, and about their circumstances of being captured by the police. So there are a lot more statements, a lot more swearing, a lot more political statements, and a lot more kind of statements about their economic circumstances. So there are commentary in the graffiti about coming to Australia for economic reasons. There's some graffiti that describes how much it cost to get to Australia via aeroplane, and then people would get off and over. If they came on a visitor visa, they'd overstay that visa. And there are tally marks as well, so where people are sort of recording the number of days that they've been held at the Immigration Detention Centre. So whilst it's another assemblage, quite a distinctive assemblage, it's contained within the four walls of the building, some of it does echo in a way the quarantine, in the way that quarantine inscriptions, in the way that people record a name, a date, or a range of dates, and somewhere that they came from. Very few of the inscriptions show details of the disease, perhaps that people were quarantined for. And in this slide, which is the last one I'll show, there are just examples of where we have some recordings that we did of the inscriptions that show the word smallpox. So it's just one ship that came in, was quarantined because of smallpox, and that's shown in those inscriptions. So strangely, for a place where disease was the main reason why people were held in quarantine, we actually have very little reference in the way that people commemorate their presence in terms of writing about the reasons for that quarantine. So, it's an unusual assemblage. It's the only one of its kind in the world that we're aware of, where people were held for reasons of disease and disease management, and where they then recorded their presence in the landscape through a series of both highly formal inscriptions, but also lots of names and dates as well. So, as I said, there's about 1,600, probably more, inscriptions. Many have faded now, through weathering on the coast. Some of the paint has faded as well. But there's enough there now for us to, build a fabulous story about people in quarantine, the relationship of quarantine episodes to migration, immigration, and then we can bring it up into the sort of just after the Second World War, and looking at the introduction of an immigration detention centre, a kind of strategy for the management of people who have overstayed visas or stowed away, come into Australia through other non-legal, if you like, means. And we still kind of manage people in immigration detention centres today. So, again, at the quarantine station, A20 is a precursor to the kind of systems that we use today. So not only are there echoes in terms of the pandemic that we're currently experiencing, but also in the kind of policies of immigration and migration and incarceration that we apply as well to illegal immigrants, or so-called illegal immigrants. And there are, we've written quite a lot about this. I know that you in your textbook that the first chapter is broadly about the quarantine station, but there's also a book that you can purchase as well. So at the quarantine, it's only now available at the quarantine station, but that's hopefully you'll be able to get that either at a local library or through your own school library. So thank you very much for listening. And I hope you've enjoyed seeing some of the slides. I hope you get to visit the quarantine station as part of your HSC studies. But at the moment, I guess that's not happening. But it's a fantastic place to visit, and it's a very evocative place to visit as well. You get really, when you're there, you really get that sense of what it would have been like to be in quarantine. So thank you very much.